Just days after saying, I do, everything almost came to an end. I never thought I'd be questioning everything about my marriage. Standing there on our wedding day, surrounded by friends and family, I thought we had it all figured out. The love, the connection, the promise of forever, it all felt so certain, so perfect. But life has a way of surprising you. And not always in the ways you expect. The honeymoon phase, people always talk about it like it's a given, like it's supposed to be this magical time filled with endless joy and passion. That's what I thought we'd have. A time to deepen our bond, to celebrate what we just promised each other. But instead, those first few nights together felt different. At first, I brushed it off. We were both exhausted from the wedding, from the months of planning and stress. I told myself it was normal, that we just needed time to adjust. But as the days passed, I started to notice the small things, moments that felt off, conversations that didn't quite land the way they used to. And then there was the bedroom. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't what I'd hoped for. The connection that had always been so easy between us felt strained, almost forced. There was an awkwardness I didn't recognize, a hesitation that made me question if we were even on the same page anymore. He seemed nervous, almost unsure of himself in ways I'd never seen before. His touches were light, fleeting, like he was afraid of doing something wrong. And as much as I tried to reassure him, to encourage him, I could feel his frustration building. One night, I decided to take the lead, hoping it would ease the tension. I kissed him softly, trying to remind him of the way we'd been before the wedding. But instead of responding, he pulled away slightly, his eyes avoiding mine. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice quiet, almost afraid of the answer. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. But his expression said otherwise. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. And in that moment, I started to wonder if this was something deeper, something I didn't know how to fix. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Was it me? Was I doing something wrong? Or was there something he wasn't telling me? The next morning, I tried to bring it up over breakfast. I asked him if everything was okay, if there was anything he wanted to talk about. He smiled, brushed it off, and changed the subject. But the unease in his eyes stayed with me. That evening, I decided to try again. This time, I was more direct. "Do you feel like we're off?" I asked, choosing my words carefully. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting with his coffee mug. And then he said it. "I don't know how to," he trailed off, his voice barely above a whisper. "How to what?" I pressed gently, leaning in closer. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "How to make you happy." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the chest. I hadn't realized how much pressure he'd been putting on himself, how much he'd been carrying in silence. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about intimacy. It was about trust, about communication, about understanding each other in a way we hadn't had to before. This wasn't what I expected marriage to be. I thought it would come naturally, that everything would fall into place like it had before. But now, just days after our wedding, I was standing at a crossroads, trying to figure out how to save something I thought was unshakable. And in that moment, I realized that if we didn't confront this together, if we didn't figure out how to navigate this new chapter, we could lose everything we just promised to build. Our wedding was everything I'd ever dreamed of. The kind of day you imagine as a little girl, the perfect dress, the laughter of friends and family, and the love of your life waiting for you at the end of the aisle. Every moment felt magical, like the start of a storybook happily ever after. I remember standing there, holding his hands, looking into his eyes as we said our vows. In that moment, I felt so certain, so secure in the love we shared. I couldn't wait to start our life together, to wake up each day knowing we'd chosen each other. The first couple of days were filled with that same joy. We were still on cloud nine, basking in the glow of what we just promised to each other. But then, slowly, subtly, something shifted. It was small things at first, awkward silences, moments where the laughter felt forced. I told myself it was nothing, that we were both just tired from the whirlwind of the wedding and the months of planning leading up to it. But when we were alone, especially in the bedroom, the unease became impossible to ignore. Our first night together as husband and wife was different. I don't know what I expected, maybe fireworks, maybe some cinematic moment where everything felt perfect. But instead, there was this hesitation between us, a nervousness that I hadn't seen before. He kissed me softly, his hands resting on my shoulders, but the usual spark wasn't there. His movements felt uncertain, his touch almost cautious, like he was second-guessing himself. I tried to reassure him, smiling, pulling him closer, but even then, it felt like something was missing. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice gentle, not wanting to push him. "Yeah," he said quickly, too quickly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We laid there afterward, side by side, the silence between us heavier than it had ever been. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just nerves, that we'd find our rhythm again. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that this was something more. As the days went on, the moments in the bedroom only grew more strained. Each time we tried to connect, the awkwardness seemed to grow. He would hesitate, his movements unsure, as if he was afraid of doing something wrong. I tried to guide him, to make things easier, but every time I did, he would pull back slightly, retreating into himself. It was like he was carrying a weight I couldn't see, something that kept him from fully being present with me. One night, as I leaned in to kiss him, he turned his head just slightly, and my lips brushed against his cheek instead. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing," he said, avoiding my gaze. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it in the way his hands trembled when he touched me, in the way his shoulders tensed when I tried to hold him close. The connection that had always come so easily to us, the intimacy we'd shared before the wedding, felt like it had been replaced with something fragile, something uncertain. I brushed it off at first, telling myself that we were just adjusting to this new chapter, that the pressure of being newlyweds was taking its toll. But the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it was to shake the feeling that something was missing. I started to question myself. Was I doing something wrong? Was I not enough for him? The doubts crept in, filling the spaces where our connection used to be. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Every time I tried, the words caught in my throat, held back by the fear of what he might say, of what I might discover. But the truth was, I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The distance between us wasn't just in the bedroom anymore, it was spilling over into every part of our relationship. And I knew, if we didn't figure out what was wrong soon, the marriage we'd just started might not survive. Every moment that should have brought us closer seemed to push us further apart. The bedroom, once a place I imagined would be filled with connection and comfort, became a space I dreaded. Each time we tried, it felt like we were moving in opposite directions, both of us lost in our own confusion and insecurities. He would touch me, but his hands lacked confidence. His kisses felt rushed, almost mechanical, as if he was following a script he didn't believe in. I tried to guide him, to slow things down, but every time I did, he seemed to retreat further into himself. One night, as we lay in bed, I reached for him, my fingers brushing his arm. "We can take our time," I whispered, trying to reassure him. He sighed, his breath heavy with frustration. "I just don't want to disappoint you," he said, his voice barely audible. His words cut deeper than I expected. I hadn't realized how much pressure he was putting on himself, how much he was carrying silently. But knowing didn't make it easier. It only made me feel more helpless. I felt trapped between wanting to fix what was broken and not knowing how to even begin. Every time we tried to connect, the gap between us seemed to widen. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how it was going to be. The silence in the room felt suffocating, filled with all the words we were too afraid to say. I started questioning everything. Was it me? Was I doing something wrong? Or was there something deeper, something we couldn't fix? The doubts crept in slowly at first, but soon they were all I could think about. Even outside the bedroom, the tension between us grew heavier. We were walking on eggshells, careful not to upset the fragile balance we were clinging to. Conversations became shorter, our laughter less frequent. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, the silence was unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore. "Do you even want this?" I blurted out, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his expression a mix of surprise and hurt. "Of course I do," he said. But his words felt hollow, like he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. I felt more alone than I'd ever expected to feel in marriage. The man I'd promised my life to felt like a stranger, and I didn't know how to reach him. The worst part was that I knew he was trying. I could see it in the way he would glance at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he would start to speak but then stop himself. He wanted to make it work, but something was holding him back, something neither of us could name. And the more we avoided it, the larger it grew. Every touch, every kiss, every moment in the bedroom felt like a test we were failing. And with each failure, the weight of it all grew heavier, threatening to crush the love we had left. I started to wonder if we'd made a mistake. If we'd rushed into something we weren't ready for. The idea terrified me, but it was hard to ignore. The truth was, we weren't just struggling in the bedroom. The tension was spilling into every part of our lives, seeping into the foundation of our relationship. And the longer we let it fester, the harder it became to see a way out. I knew we couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. But I didn't know if we had the strength to face what needed to be done. One night, after another failed attempt to connect, I couldn't hold it in any longer. We had tried again, tried to bridge the distance between us, but it ended the same way it always did. Awkward touches, hesitant movements, and an overwhelming silence that followed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. I felt frustration bubbling up inside me, hot and relentless, and before I could stop myself, the words came spilling out. "Why is this so hard for us?" I said, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening as I waited for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. "We're married," I continued, my voice breaking. "We're supposed to be happy, to feel close. Why does it feel like we're miles apart?" He sat up then, his back to me, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of my words had physically struck him. "I'm trying," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how." Something in his tone made me stop, the anger I'd felt moments before replaced by a wave of confusion and sadness. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw it, the fear in his eyes, the shame he'd been carrying in silence. "I don't want to disappoint you," he said, his voice cracking. "But every time we try, I feel like I'm failing. Like I'm not enough." His words hit me like a blow, shattering the narrative I'd built in my head. This wasn't just about me, about my frustrations or my doubts. He was struggling too, caught in his own spiral of insecurity and fear. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly, unsure of what to say but desperate to bridge the gap between us. "You're not failing," I said finally, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "We're just lost. But we can find our way back. Together." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about intimacy or the bedroom. It was about us, about the trust and communication we'd lost along the way. If we didn't confront it now, if we didn't face this together, we might lose everything. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. "We'll figure it out," I said, holding his gaze. "One step at a time." And in that moment, something shifted. The walls between us didn't disappear, but they began to crack, letting in the possibility of hope. That night marked the turning point. After years of believing that love alone was enough to bridge every gap, we finally began to face the truth, that love, without effort, without understanding, could falter. We started talking, really talking, about what we wanted, what we needed, and what was holding us back. Those conversations weren't easy. They were filled with moments of hesitation, awkward silences, and emotions we'd both kept buried. "I'm afraid," he admitted one evening, his voice trembling. "Afraid of not being good enough for you. Of letting you down." Hearing him say those words broke my heart, but it also gave me clarity. His struggles weren't about a lack of love or desire. They were rooted in fear, in the expectations he thought he had to meet but didn't know how to express. I shared my fears too, the doubts I hadn't voiced, the moments I'd felt unseen or disconnected. And for the first time, we began to truly understand each other. We didn't just stop at talking. We decided to rebuild together, step by step. I suggested we slow down, take the pressure off. Instead of focusing on the outcome, we started focusing on the moments, the small, intimate gestures that had always been the foundation of our relationship. One night, I lit candles in the bedroom, not for romance, but to create a space that felt warm, safe, and inviting. I asked him to sit with me, and together we talked about what made us feel loved, about the moments that brought us the most joy. "It's not about getting it right," I told him, my hand resting on his. "It's about being present, about us finding our way back to each other." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and relief. And that night, for the first time in weeks, we held each other without the weight of expectation. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, of uncertainty. But each touch, each kiss, carried a new meaning, a willingness to try, to trust, to let go of the fear that had held us back. For the first time, we were honest with each other about our fears and insecurities. And slowly, we began to rebuild the intimacy we'd lost. We sought advice, read books together, and even laughed at how much we still had to learn about each other. And in those moments, I realized something profound: intimacy isn't about perfection. It's about connection, about meeting each other where you are and choosing to move forward together. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't happen overnight. But each step brought us closer, not just as a couple, but as partners who truly understood each other. Looking back now, I can see how far we've come. Those early struggles tested us in ways I never expected, but they also taught us how to grow, how to communicate, and how to love each other in a way that's real and lasting.